in September of 1913. It's called 2 Acres, which is the name of a house in Stanmore, which then was a village on an absolute northernmost edge of London. Now is completely sort of engrossed by London, but then was somewhere where you could get into London on the train each day and go to the office, but at the end of the garden there were woods and fields. It's the home of a widow called Frida Saul and her 3 children. Hubert, who goes to work in an office just like that. George, who's 18 and studying at Cambridge, and his 16-year-old sister Daphne. George has brought home, he's never really sort of had a friend before, but he's brought home an older friend from Cambridge called Cecil Valence, who's making a name for himself as a poet. He comes from a minor aristocratic family and has written a lot of poems about the family seat, a hideous Victorian house called Corley Court. And Daphne, the young sister, who's totally innocent in any matters of anything really, particularly of love and sex, is getting her first tremors of excitement at the presence of Cecil. What nobody else in this weekend party knows is that Cecil and George are in fact having a passionate affair. The reader has seen them in the previous chapter going to walk in the woods in the afternoon, and actually with unusual restraint, I don't actually describe what they get up to, but whilst they are getting up to it, George spots his sister's red hat approaching along the edge of the wood, and there's rather a panic as to whether Daphne has actually seen them at it. After dinner, it's the last evening of Cecil's stay. The previous evening, he's read to them from Tennyson's In Memoriam, and they've variously been impressed or fallen asleep. In Memoriam is the great elegiac poem by Tennyson, written for his own Cambridge friend, Arthur Henry Hallam, who died very young. And it's the poem from which the title of the novel, The Stranger's Child, comes. It's a beautiful section of the poem where Tennyson imagines the beloved landscape where he has grown up after he and his family and everyone he knows have left it. And he imagines the years changing, the stream still running down into the valley, until way into the future, the landscape will grow familiar to the stranger's child. That's to say, not only to people we don't know, but to future generations of people we don't know. And the novel really is largely about what happens to the reputation of this young poet over the coming century. His reputation, his futurity, ends up, of course, in the hands of people he could never know. I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that he's going to meet his end in the Battle of the Somme. I'll read for about 10 minutes or so, if that's all right. So it's after dinner, Cecil and Daphne find themselves suddenly alone in the sitting room of the house. Cecil was fingering in his waistcoat pocket, then brought out his little clipper. He said, "I wonder if Miss Saul would care to keep me company while I enjoy my cigar." "Oh yes," said Daphne. "Oh, I'll get a coat." And she ran to the cloakroom under the stairs. It was such an exciting idea that there were bound to be strenuous arguments against it. But that was part of Cecil's atmosphere and appeal. She came back, not with her own dull coat, but with one of George's old tweed jackets round her shoulders. She liked the air of improvisation. A man's jacket seemed to show she was up for a lark and to carry some chivalrous hint of her need for protection. "It's a little bit smelly," she said, though she hardly imagined that would worry Cecil. "Well, I'm going to make a smell too." "Well, quite." "I may be being too sensitive," said Cecil, glancing towards the door. "My mother's so down on smoke. At Corley Court, we all sneak off to the smoking room. She's made it into quite a guilty pleasure." "No, no," said Daphne. Cecil drew out a cigar case from a surprising pocket. "I got 2 if you're tempted to try," he said, and uncapped the stiff leather sheath to show her the tops of them. They made her think of soldiers, or the cartridges in Hubert's rifle. She saw it might be wittier not to answer, and he seemed amused by her condescending smile. She knew she should call to her mother, but sighed just to think of the objections, and followed Cecil out into the garden, leaving the French window ajar. It was quite a bit colder than last night, though she was not going to mention it. She said, "Cecil, I think I shall always associate in memoriam with you." "Well," Cecil was fussing with a lighted match and making impatient, appreciative noises as he blew on the cigar. Then the newly conjured smoke was all around them. "Shall we sit here?" "Let's walk on," said Cecil, moving her along past the windows of the sitting room. "We'll see what the stars are up to, shall we?" "All right," said Daphne, and as he crooked his arm, she reached up to slip her hand through it. As well as everything else, there was something entirely proper about Cecil. He perhaps wasn't even aware of her happy sense of play acting, her toss of the head in the dark as she took his arm. Then George's jacket, merely slung round her shoulders, slipped off. "Here, let me help you." In the gloom on the edge of the lawn, Cecil held the coat and patted her shoulders when she got it on. "I must look like a tramp," she said, her hands covered by the sleeves, silky linings cold for a moment on bare arms, the weight and smell of the thing hugged round her. "Do it up," said Cecil, his cigar between his teeth. And again, his large hands seemed to take care of her, to be larger and more capable than ever. Then he offered his arm once more. They went on a few leisurely paces, Daphne happily self-conscious, Cecil a touch reserved, though she wasn't sure of his face, and perhaps he was merely working out the stars. She knew he'd had 3 or 4 glasses of wine. Decisions would come easily to him, though to a sober person they might seem whimsical and delayed. She looked up above the silhouette of the treetops. "I fear it's too cloudy tonight, Cecil," she said. Cecil huffed out another cloud of rich, sour smoke and cackled vaguely. "Were you in the woods for long this afternoon?" he said. "This afternoon? No, not really. You didn't get much of a walk." "Well, when I saw you, I came home, of course." She felt him press her arm more tightly against his side, and the beautiful, grown-up presence of Cecil, his height and his muscular warmth under evening dress, and even his voice, which she once thought so cutting and grand, slightly turned her head. "It must have been someone else we saw earlier on. I said to Georgie, 'Isn't that daft?' But by the time he looked, whoever it was had gone." "Well, it could have been. Did you call?" "You know, I wasn't sure. Lots of people do walk there." "Of course," said Cecil. "Anyway, you didn't see us." Daphne felt again she was missing something, but was carried along by the excitement of making conversation, squeezed his arm reassuringly. "I would have said hello if I had. I thought you would. To be honest, it's George. He doesn't want me tagging along." Cecil made a low, disparaging murmur, and they turned round. "You can see a bit better now," he said. "There's the famous rockery." "I know." She felt he was still rather mocking the rockery, and it emboldened her. "Cecil," she said, "when may I come to Corley?" To Corley? It was as though he'd never heard of such a place, and certainly had no memory of his earlier invitation. Then he laughed. "My dear girl, whenever you like." "Oh, thank you. Whenever you like," he said again, expanding into his decision in a tone which seemed oddly to undermine it. "I suppose it won't be till the Christmas back now, probably, will it?" This seemed as good as never to Daphne. "No, I suppose. Get Georgie to bring you over." They moved on towards the dark outline of the rockery, which at night might truly have been taken for a greater and more distant outcrop. Daphne said, huskily casual, "I imagine I could come by myself." "Would your mother allow that?" "I am quite grown up, you know," said Daphne. Cecil said nothing. He pressed forward with his usual confidence. She thought she should say, "There's a step there." She half yelled it as he stumbled and lurched down hard on his right leg, caught himself but pulled her with him, and then lurched again to save her and grip her. "Oh, Christ, are you all right?" "I'm fine," wincing where he'd trodden heavily on the edge of her foot. "And now I've lost my dratted cigar." They were face to face, her heart still lively from the shock, and he put his arms round her waist and pulled her against him so that she had to turn her cheek to his cold lapel. He moved a hand up and down on her back, over the warm tweed of George's jacket. "Blasted steps," he said. "I'm all right," said Daphne. She rather dreaded looking at her shoe when they got in, but Cecil was at a disadvantage, and she knew at once that he could never be blamed for anything. She said quietly, I can't think how those steps got there. Cecil gave a sigh of a laugh across her hair. Oh, child, child, he said, with a softness and a sadness she had never heard before, even from her mother. What are we going to do? Daphne eased herself a fraction freer. She wanted to play her part, felt the privilege of Cecil's attention, and it was awfully nice being held so tightly by him, but there was something in his tone that worried her. Well, I suppose you're going to have to pack. Ah, said Cecil, again with a strange, despairing note, like his poetry voice. I think, shall we go back in? Yes, yes, he said. Can you keep a secret, Daph? As a rule, said Daphne. Let's keep this a secret. All right. She wasn't sure if she understood. Falling over a step wasn't much of a secret, but Cecil was clearly embarrassed by it. His hand relaxed slightly and travelled down almost to her bottom as he smiled and murmured, You know, it's been splendid getting to know you. Oh, well, she said, somehow paralysed by his hand. That's what we're all saying about you. There's never been anything like it. He bent his head and kissed her on the forehead, like sending her to bed. And then the tip of his nose moved down her cheek, and he kissed her beside her mouth in his cigar breath, and then, completely without expression, on her lips. There, he said. Cecil, don't be silly, she said, you've been drinking. And he tilted his face sideways and pushed his open mouth over hers and worked his tongue against her teeth in a quite idiotic and unpleasant way. She pushed herself half free of him. She was alarmed, but kept her composure, even laughed rather sarcastically. You don't mind if I kiss you, said Cecil dreamily. I don't call that kissing, Cecil, she said. Said Cecil. What would you call kissing then, Daphne? His tone dopey and mocking, slightly annoyed, tugging her back into his grasp like a dancer with a mere flourish of his suddenly inescapable strength. Or something like this. And he started again, just darting his lips all over her face like a tormenting game, allowing her to dodge and turn her head a little, but holding her so tightly about the waist that she was quite hurt by the hard shape of the cigar case in his trouser pocket thrusting against her stomach. She found she was giggling in quick, shallow breaths, and before she could help it, they turned into hot little sobs, and then a hushed wail of childlike surrender and failure. Hello? It was George, back from the Cosgroves, coming to look for them, surely. Childish, timid relief mixed almost at once with pride. But no, it was Hubert, in a funny voice, apologetic, but actually rather cross. I say! Cecil loosened his grip, sighed acceptingly, though the little snigger he gave seemed to say he hadn't given up. He looked round over the top of the bushes to see who it was. And again, she felt the special subject of her own secret with Cecil. They both had to be careful. She'd been frightened by him, but she still had a sense that he would know what to do. We're over here, she said, her voice clotted with crying. I'm all right. I fell down the blasted steps, said Cecil. I think you've trodden on your sister. Hubert stood there in silhouette, conveying an indignant but undecided impression. Can you walk? He said, very distinctly, as though speaking over the telephone. Of course I can walk. We're just coming in. It's really a bit dark for rambling round, Hubert said. That was the point, said Cecil. We were studying the stars. Hubert peered upwards doubtfully. It's a bit cloudy for that, he said, and turned back to the house.